Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Finneran's Wake. My guest today, of whose existence I became aware in the unlikeliest of ways, is Professor Eric Lager. Professor Lager, a native of Chicago, Illinois, obtained degrees in history from the University of Florida and then Clemson University, before pursuing and earning his Ph.D. in that same subject from the University of Tennessee. Professor Lager specializes in and lectures on the history of antebellum America, the Civil War, and the state in which that war began, the Palmetto State, South Carolina, in which he and his family reside, and at whose famed Citadel University he currently teaches. Whilst an undergraduate, perhaps frightened by the uncertain path down which a degree in history might lead him, Professor Lager completed a minor concentration in parks, recreation, and tourism, which, at last, serves as the unexpected link by which we've been joined. As it happens, Professor Lager is not only an historian, but an entrepreneur. He's the founder and operator of Charleston History Walk, a guided tour through that enchanted city, of which he has, as you'll soon realize, not only an historian's knowledge and a professional academic's interest and mastery, but a resident's simple-hearted fondness. My dear parents, who very seldom travel, embarked last summer on a long road trip from New Jersey down to Florida. Along the way, they stopped at Charleston and joined you on one of your tours. That evening, they called me in rapturous delight. They absolutely loved every minute of your tour and thought that I, layman, a student of history, could have talked with you all day. And so with their endorsement, I reached out to you on your website, to which I'll include a link in the show notes below, and am blessed now to have the opportunity to talk with you. If not for a day, then at least for a brief little while. So Professor Lager, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
So I think we'll get right into it. I want to begin by reading a letter that was dispatched, but as circumstances would have it, undelivered to a one Robert Anderson, the U.S. Army major stationed at a tiny little island in Charleston Harbor by the name of Fort Sumter. Now, Major Anderson, now in early April 1861, found himself in a most unenviable position. Fort Sumter, the federal garrison to which he was forced to relocate his regiment, was, for all intents and purposes, under siege. Had he received the following letter from the War Department in Washington, of which Simon Cameron was then the secretary, the heavy forebodings by which he was burdened might have been lifted. I read now the contents of that forgotten letter sent to him, and I'd like to hear your response. "Sir," he said, "your letter of the first occasioned some anxiety to the president, the newly inaugurated President Lincoln. He had supposed you could hold out till the 15th without any great inconvenience, and had prepared an expedition to relieve you before that period. Hoping still that you will be able to sustain yourself till the 11th or the 12th, the expedition will go forward, and, finding your American flag flying, will attempt to provision you, and in the case the effort is resisted, will endeavor also to reinforce you." Professor Lager, if you would, I'd like for you to explain to us, how did we get here? How did we arrive at this moment?
Well, it's a great question. It wasn't an immediate situation. This is something that had been brewing for a long time in the Palmetto State. I'll say, first of all, that December 20th, 1860, when South Carolina seceded from the Union by a vote of 169-0 in favor of secession, was not the first time South Carolina had tried to secede. They had tried to after the Nullification crisis in 1832. They tried again after the Compromise of 1850. They tried in 1852, but no other southern state would come along with South Carolina, and she didn't want to go it alone. And it's really Lincoln's election in November of 1860 that's the straw that breaks the camel's back in this particular situation. Now, again, this had been brewing for a while, but you have all sorts of crises following crises after the Mexican-American War ended in 1848. And finally, you find yourself in 1860 with the election of the first Republican president. How many South Carolinians voted for Lincoln? Zero. He wasn't on the ballot down here in South Carolina. At that time, there was no such thing as a state-issued ballot. It was up to candidates' names to place tickets on tickets and distribute those. Well, Republican Party was pledged to arrest the further expansion of slavery into the territories. That's not a popular position here in South Carolina, so there was no Republican Party present. So he wasn't seen as a legitimate president, and in response, you have the Secession Convention that occurs in December 1860, and this time other southern states did come on board. And by February, you have the formation of the newly formed Confederate States of America that are in place. And just prior to that, a week after that ordinance of secession passed, Major Robert Anderson, who you were referring to, was actually over in Fort Moultrie, which is located on Sullivan's Island. That's the old palmetto log fort from the American Revolution, had been turned into a brick and mortar fort. And he was concerned that his garrison was vulnerable to South Carolina militia. So he moved his garrison a week after the ordinance of secession passed over to Fort Sumter, where he was a little bit more secure at the time. And interestingly enough, the governor of South Carolina at the time, Governor Francis Pickens, he was under a lot of pressure to remove those federal soldiers immediately from Fort Sumter, because South Carolina was claiming independence and honor is at stake. And one individual in particular, Robert Barnwell Rhett, who is sometimes called the father of secession, he had been preaching secession for 30 years from the editorial columns of his newspaper, the Charleston Mercury, was kind of screaming at Pickens to go storm the fort. And Pickens was getting kind of frustrated and said, you know, Mr. Rhett, I can go ahead and get you a boat and some men and some guns, and you're welcome to go storm the fort if that's what you want to do. And Rhett says, well, sir, Governor, I'm not a military man. And Pickens, who had been the minister to Russia during the 1850s, said, I'm not a military man either, so therefore I'm going to listen to my advisors. And the advice was keep a cool head for the moment. So no action was taken. Now, if you talk to a Citadel cadet here at the campus here, they'll be very clear to remind you that it wasn't the Confederacy that fired the first shots on Fort Sumter on April 12th, 1861. It was Citadel cadets that fired the first shot on January 9th, 1861, when President James Buchanan had made an effort to resupply the fort in what was called the Star of the West. And Citadel cadets fired on the Star of the West from Fort Johnson, which is on James Island. There's actually two forts that are overlooking Fort Sumter, Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island, and then Fort Johnson on James Island. And so that Star of the West just turned right around and steamed back north. And that's where things stood in March of 1861 when Lincoln took office. Lincoln had made a pledge to hold on to federal property, and that included Fort Sumter. And those men were about to be starved out. So he made the decision to resupply the fort. And that was unacceptable to the South. Again, trying to impress Great Britain and France now, and sovereignty, honors at stake. So when it became clear Lincoln was serious, that momentous step was taken at 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, when PGT, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, gave the command to open fire, and the first shot of the Civil War was fired from Fort Johnson onto Fort Sumter.
The first official shot.
Official shot. Yes, not if you talk to a Citadel cadet, but
right. So these same students upon whom you are bestowing all of your wisdom are responsible, or at least their forebears are responsible for the first true shots of the Civil War.
I think you can make a case that was indeed the first shot of the Civil War. But I think let's go with the standard history.
Yeah. Now, is that a legacy to which your students firmly hold?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, the highest academic scholarship that you can get here at the Citadel is called the Star of the West Scholarship. And so
very good. Very good. That's a fascinating history and very succinctly put forward. I feel like I'll need to go back and listen to that and re-listen to that time and again. But you mentioned something right at the get-go, right at the start of that erudite explanation, on which I want to focus a little bit more, and that is South Carolina's history of, how shall we say, naughtiness, of maybe of misbehavior from the federal government's perspective. This is not exactly an historical question. Maybe in some ways it is, but I ask you, to what do you attribute this penchant for resistance to federal governmental decrees? Is something in the water down there in South Carolina?
Yeah, you would think so. It's a question that historians have wrestled with. I'm not going to certainly encourage anybody to go out there and download my dissertation, and that's not, you might have, it might work well for you if you're having trouble sleeping at night, and then you can read that and that'll help you. But it's the first thing I really address. It's my first footnote, and that footnote is about a page and a half long, referencing all of the works that have tried to sort out that question of why South Carolina was so extreme, unique, different, and the most obvious word would be radical. There's a great book out there by Lacey Ford Jr. called Origins of Southern Radicalism, and it's about South Carolina in the upcountry, actually. There's a lot of theories put forth. They've developed somewhat of an insular society that wasn't permeated well by outside influences. There is the proportion of slaveholders to non-slaveholders compared to other southern states, which definitely was the highest in South Carolina. There's the fact that actually South Carolina was suffering economically as we opened up the old Southwest, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, to short staple cotton cultivation. South Carolina had an outmigration, so it's losing people, and of course that means it's losing power in the House of Representatives. And there's a lot of factors, both internal and external, that kind of come into play here. There's no simple answer to it. South Carolinians very zealously guarded their liberties. They felt like they had been under threat multiple times. John C. Calhoun helped enunciate a lot of this ideology during the Nullification crisis. Going back to the 1820s, he did not get along very well with President Andrew Jackson. And there is, I think, a lot of concern here that South Carolina is kind of being overwhelmed and surrounded by more powerful beings, both north and around them in the south as well. Now, the article that deals with this most relevantly is a guy named James Banner, Banner, and he titles this article literally "The Problem of South Carolina," and he deals with that more directly. So it's not anything that could be answered directly in a couple of sentences. It's a lot of economic, social circumstances. Certainly slavery is among the top of those, but also economically as well, as South Carolina really began to fall behind. Its grandeur in the colonial period was kind of at an end by the late antebellum period. So they took the lead, and this time they got others around them to come on board.
Yeah, and I think that's a better explanation than those that I've come up with. Just as a layman, sort of viewing South Carolina through history, it seems peculiar that so many extraordinary figures emerge from this one refractory state. You mentioned Calhoun. You mentioned congressmen, of which there are two predominantly that come to mind. I think of Preston Brooks and a congressman and his uncle, Andrew Butler.
Andrew Butler.
Yeah. And Butler was the man, for those of you listening, upon whom one Charles Sumner of Massachusetts perhaps too liberally poured his invective, and was thus treated to a few quite unfriendly blows on and about the body in the congressional chamber. So we
Right.
witness all sort of
Right.
congressional misbehavior nowadays, with people standing up in the State of the Union and denouncing a president's words, perhaps. But
Well, I actually
never
had
anything quite like this.
just
So
had
can
somebody
you?
on my tour asked today about. She asked. She's like, "Oh wow." She's like, "Do you think the rhetoric is pretty bad nowadays in Congress?" I'm like, "Well, certainly not compared to 1850s South Carolina." Preston Brooks was a congressman from Edgefield, South Carolina. Edgefield has had a lot of governors. I might be off on this, but I think 11 governors have been sent to the State House in Columbia from Edgefield, and they have a penchant for some violence. Probably more duels fought there than anywhere else in the state. And Preston Brooks, after listening to this speech, which was called "The Crimes Against Kansas" that Charles Sumner gave, walked up to him and said, "Sir, you've insulted my state, my family, our honor," and began to beat him with a gutta percha cane, and so badly bloodied that he couldn't return to the Senate floor for a couple of years. Broke his cane over the poor man's head, and what did South Carolinians do? Well, they sent him new canes. And after he resigned from office, he was then unanimously reelected to office. So certainly,
But didn't survive the ordeal by many years, if I'm not
no,
mistaken.
he died
He died
shortly.
a few years thereafter.
Yeah,
Right.
quickly after.
I wonder, hidden away somewhere in either South Carolina or in the basement of our Capitol building, do the remnants of that cane exist? Do you know?
I don't know. I don't know that. I kind of doubt it, would be my suspicion. And if it was there, it's probably some sort of replica of sorts. I don't know, actually. I've never thought about that. I don't suspect it is.
Yeah, that would be quite an article to
Yeah.
have in one's possession.
Yeah.
Quite an article to have.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for expanding on that notion of South Carolina's sort of intuitive, natural.
Let me go ahead and tell you a little bit more about what's interesting. So you got this unique kind of ideology that occurs that results in secession. But I'll say that not long into the Civil War, just 8 months, in fact, November 1861, just to the south of Charleston, a very important port called Port Royal, which is present-day Hilton Head, South Carolina, that was captured by the Union in what was the largest amphibious invasion in United States history in the 19th century, and captured Hilton Head, and that inaugurated a period of intense, let's call it, political experiments here in South Carolina, because it created what we're unfortunately familiar with right now in Eastern Europe. It created a refugee crisis in South Carolina. Hundreds of the most prominent families came pouring into Charleston. These were very wealthy families. And then on December 11th, 1861, a massive fire breaks out in Charleston. On December 11th, 1861, destroys 540 acres and about 575 buildings, $8 million worth of property damage. And this was a catastrophe on a scale that South Carolinians never envisioned when they voted to secede 8 months prior, or at this point, 11 months prior. And what happens is the governor of South Carolina is, for all intents and purposes, removed. He is usurped from power, and you have this executive council that is formed consisting of 5 men, each with a separate department, that for all intents and purposes takes control of the state. And that's really what my dissertation looked at, was this South Carolina Executive Council. It's a fascinating story in which South Carolina really overthrew their own constitution in order to get the state on a more solid war footing, because things were not looking good and didn't go well the first year of the war. And this body really could do whatever it wanted to do. It could draw money from the public treasury without legislative authorization. It could impress supplies, and it could confiscate private property deemed necessary for public use. And it created a firestorm of political controversy here in South Carolina, so much so that it was eventually dissolved at the end of 1862. But it's just kind of interesting that South Carolinians, they found themselves with this new government called the Executive Council. And a lot of South Carolinians were scratching their heads saying, hey, I thought we seceded here to protect constitutional government. Um, and
Yeah, almost as though they had transitioned from a state of enhanced liberties to one of an impending despotism,
exactly.
a martial despotism.
Yeah, and newspaper editors really launched a crusade against the executive council. I think probably some of the caricatures of it were a little unfair. I mean, these men were not strangers. They were James Chestnut Jr., for instance, was the head of the Department of the Military. He's the husband of the very famous diarist Mary Chestnut. And in any case, these men did what they were supposed to do. They put the state on a more permanent war footing. They created saltpeter plantations. They constructed foundries that were building gun carriages. They beefed up all the fortifications along the coastline. So they did what they were intended to do, but they had to take some pretty heavy-handed measures to do it. And that resulted in a very interesting and not well-known political episode in South Carolina's Civil War history that really lasted throughout 1862.
Sure, sure. Now, you mentioned Mary Chestnut. She's someone to whom Ken Burns, in his famous and laudable documentary, he makes constant reference. But the point that you make is really interesting and really well taken, is that there was a lot of internal strife within South Carolina, perhaps as not unexpectedly, surrounding the alteration of their governmental structure in anticipation of this war and during the early stages of this war. That's something really to take into consideration.
Well, it is a lot of internal strife, a lot of internal disagreement over how the state should be governed. And South Carolina, for all its sectional troubles with the rest of the country, has had plenty of sectional troubles within itself. You have really three geographic areas of South Carolina: the Low Country, where I'm at, down in Charleston, but then you have the Midlands, and then you have the Up Country. Well, these are areas of the country that have different interests, different economies, and different histories to some extent. And the upstate and the Low Country has been at each other's throats throughout the state's history as well.
Yeah, as is always the case in any state, large or small, in any country. I think of the Italian North being in opposition to the Italian South, and the same thing persists in all times and in all places. So we're coming toward the end of our conversation. I wanted to ask you two more questions.
Sure.
One is about President Buchanan's lame duck period. I think his lame duck period is overlooked, and I find this part of his history and our American history to be one that we should take a harder look at. So before the ratification of the 20th Amendment to the Constitution in 1933, of course, the president-elect would have to wait until the 4th of March to be sworn into office. That's when Lincoln would be sworn in. The election, of course, was held in November, the first Tuesday of November of that prior year. So in a time of peace, this interregnum was generally expected to be, on the whole, uneventful. Right? The departing president would enter upon a new inglorious life as a lame duck, as the Congress would usually try and fail to pass through last-ditch bills and laws. So the winter of 1860 to 1861, this lame duck period for President Buchanan, was anything but boring in the traditional sense. So tell us, you mentioned a few of the events already, but sort of the highlights of that tumultuous period of time.
Well, I think that, Buchanan has his hands full here. He does know he's on his way out of office, but he also has a pledge to uphold the Constitution. He's in a tricky position. He is declaring that secession is illegal on the one hand, but he doesn't want to instigate something that's going to trigger a war either. I will say this. I think that there is a lot more diplomacy going on between the United States and the Confederate States than what we know from just general histories. There's a great book out there called South Carolina Goes to War, written by a man named Charles Coffin, old book, 1950, but he probably does better than anyone else in a chapter called Fort's Diplomacy. I mean, there are messengers, there are representatives being sent from South Carolina, from the Confederates. They are meeting with Buchanan. They are meeting well into even after Lincoln comes into office. So this doesn't happen out of nowhere. I think that Buchanan's also got concerns because there are other federal installations that are being seized. There's arsenals, there's gunpowder magazines that are being seized by Southern militias. You have Fort Pickens down in Pensacola, for instance. But forts all up and down the eastern United States are coming into possession of Southern militias and Confederate forces. So Buchanan can't really be strong everywhere at once. And so the pinnacle of focus really zeroes in on Charleston, and perhaps understandably so. But there's a lot of things that Buchanan is trying to juggle. He has kind of had a pretty poor evaluation by historians over the years, and I think that.
Do you think that assessment is unmerited? Do you think we should re-examine our image of Buchanan?
I wouldn't necessarily go and lavish a bunch of praise on him. I think that if you're looking at it from a practical standpoint, there wasn't necessarily a lot he could have done to arrest this situation. You have the Montgomery Convention that forms in Alabama in February, and for all intents and purposes, the South had declared a new nation. They had written a constitution. They had elected Jefferson Davis as provisional president of the Confederacy. So I don't think there was a lot of options necessarily for Buchanan. You probably weren't going to have a whole lot of luck coercing the South back into the Union. Lincoln certainly didn't have any luck at doing that either. So, yeah, I don't think it's a bad idea to kind of reassess, or at least kind of acknowledge that this was a complicated situation and that he was indeed in negotiations and trying to sort out the problems. And he did, after all, send Star of the West down to resupply the Fort Sumter. Whether or not he should have, in the aftermath, declared a rebellion in order after the Star of the Cadet or the Star of the West was fired on is maybe an interesting point, but I don't necessarily know if he was quite ready yet at that point for a war to ensue as a result of just merely firing on a supply ship.
I wonder if there's something almost literary and cosmic and poetic about his sending a ship by the name of the Star of the West, given the fact that later in the war, of course, we have the likes of Grant and Sherman, both residents of the West, coming in and basically saving the Union. Just an aside, just something.
That's a very interesting. I've never made that.
Comes to mind, yeah. Almost.
Well, I think a lot of historians would argue that the war, ultimately, the Civil War, was won in the West. That perhaps we should maybe lay off a little bit of attention to the Eastern theater, which of course was critical, but there's no question that the river systems, which run largely north to south in the West, were great avenues of invasion for the Union to penetrate with their brown water navy, freshwater navy, and secure those inland waterways and slowly but surely penetrate into the Confederate heartland.
Yeah, I think the contributions of Westerners and the Western expanse is probably neglected. And of course, the point of the Civil War was, or at least one of the major points was that we were arguing over the expansion of slavery into the Western territories.
Right.
So I want to pose to you a hypothetical. Okay. So imagine you had the ability to travel back in time. Indeed, imagine you were, as you are now, a learned man who departed the free state of Illinois for the slave state of South Carolina. So in the election of 1860, there were, of course, 4 candidates for whom you could have voted, right?
Yeah.
Lincoln, of course, Douglas, the Northern Democrat, Breckinridge, and Bell. So we all like to think that had we been in that time at that place, Lincoln would have been our natural selection, right? But I think, this is self-flattery, historical self-flattery. He received, of course, a minority of the popular vote. So you can be a Lincoln man, but just because you have this unique perspective as a Northerner who's resettled in the South, tell me, for whom might you have voted? And if not that, tell us at least what were some of the rationales for voting for someone other than Lincoln?
Well, John Bell Hood is an interesting candidate, right? He runs under what's called the Constitutional Union Party. That's kind of vague. It basically says, let's follow the Constitution. Well, of course, there's disagreements on how to interpret the Constitution. Douglas had really, maybe not, of course, on purpose, but he kind of finagled this crisis to sort of arise with his Kansas Nebraska Act of 1854. He wants to build a transcontinental railroad. He would like it to begin in Chicago, which also happens to be where he's from. Southerners want a transcontinental railroad too. They want it to begin in New Orleans. So, and that, by doing that, that really opened up a whole can of worms, because it opened up that Kansas-Nebraska territory to popular sovereignty, which sounds all nice and cozy. The people will get to decide for themselves. Well, of course, you have fraudulent elections, people rushing in to try to take control of these territorial legislatures. So I don't know, he probably wouldn't have been a good pick. Now, it's funny that the Democratic Convention was held in Charleston in 1860, April of 1860. After 57 ballots, they couldn't agree on a candidate, and that split the party into two. So I don't know if I would have voted for John Bell Hood. There was a compromise called the Crittenden Compromise that was offered that was trying to sort this out. And I think the fact is, by this point, we had a solid 10, 12 years of sectional tension. It seems both sides are kind of itching for a fight at this point. I always pose this question to my students when we talk about secession, and I say, the North had just gotten 40, 50 years of this sectional antagonism from the South. Why not just let the South go? Why not just say, good riddance, go ahead, self-government? Well, there's certainly always some economics that come into play, but it's more than that. It's this idea that this great experiment in democracy might fail. This whole idea of Republican government, not the party, but representative government, constitutional procedure, elections. I mean, this was a legitimate election. It was a legal one. And the idea that majority rule could be overturned by a sectional minority, that's really why the North, and many folks, I mean, everyone's got different reasons for fighting, and probably a lot of them aren't giving that much philosophical thought to it. But the idea that we don't want to end up like Europe in a bunch of confederated, broken states that's constantly at war, of course, which England and France were throughout the entire 18th century, I think is what kind of, made Lincoln sort of stand out and become a man that stood for representative government and democracy. Although, of course, there's plenty of historians, and rightfully could point to the very unconstitutional nature of some of his governance during the war itself, too.
Yes, of course, the immediate suspension of the writ of habeas corpus and similar
Right.
unconstitutional measures that had to be taken, or at least justified by a time of war. So yes, of course, I mean, it was our founders' dream and their intention to have an indissoluble union, and that's something to which Lincoln hearkened and tried to uphold through the course of his
a fascinating time period. It's really the crossroads of America, and that really helped us to become who we are in the end.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And who we're becoming. So I want to end with one question. It's a personal one. So as I mentioned, you're from Chicago, Illinois.
Right.
The land of Lincoln.
Yeah.
You're now a resident of and an expert on Charleston, South Carolina, the city with which Lincoln had the most trouble. Right. So how do you reconcile the Lincolnian prejudices of your birth and your rearing with your current immersion in all that is Charleston, South Carolina? Is there some internal conflict that overwhelms you every single day that you wake up in that balmy southern clime?
Oh, I don't think so, to be honest. I grew up fond of Lincoln. I was a school kid. We went to Springfield, and I remember seeing Lincoln's tomb from a very young age. Um, so, my interest in South Carolina, well, I got interested in this really in high school. I started doing some Civil War reenacting, and they always had more Northern reenactors than Southern. And so I thought to even it up a little bit, I would do South. And I actually did infantry regiment out of Tennessee, 154th Tennessee. And that kind of, got me interested as I grew a little older. I'm like, oh, well, this was a separate country. How did they have a government? Did they have a Senate, a House, the president? How did all that work out? So that really brought me into my interest in the Confederate government. And when I went to Clemson for my master's degree, I told my advisor, I'm like, I'd like to write a thesis on the Confederate Congress. He said, Eric, that's way too big of a topic. Find something smaller. So that led me to the Secession Convention, which eventually led me to the state legislature. And that I expanded on during my dissertation, which was really a study of the state government from 1861 to 1862. So I've become pretty immersed in South Carolina history. I find that people down here are perfectly friendly. They're very welcoming, and it's a great place to live because I'm surrounded by history. Everywhere you look, you got something historical to take a look at. So I can reconcile Lincoln with where I'm at now pretty well. I've always tried to, as far as Southerners go and the Confederacy, I think people need to remember that Southerners are the only Americans up until the Vietnam War that had ever lost a war. And there was a lot of sacrifice. Almost a quarter of the population in South Carolina was either dead or wounded in the prime of their life. And that meant there were a lot of mothers, widows, and daughters around. And so I think it makes sense to me that people would want to look back and try to not necessarily glorify, but at least honor what their ancestors had fought for. And, the idea, of course, that people ought to have the same values we have today that lived back then is probably not fair. It's fair to criticize perhaps what they stood for, but to remember that they're imperfect beings, and that's just human nature to make mistakes, and I think we ought to learn from those and honor the past as best we can while being respectable of things that might be hurtful to some people today. It's an interesting time period to look at and kind of difficult to balance, but it ought to be done.
Yeah, had we the time, that's exactly the direction down which I wanted to go. I would have talked about the legacy of the Civil War, the conflict we see today about statuary, for instance.
Right.
Do we keep them up? Do we uphold them not as moral exemplars, but as testaments to a history, right? Or do we take them down, and do we replace them?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. Everyone is going to have different answers. I think probably the short answer is that it might be best to learn from those mistakes rather than tearing everything down, because then there's nothing to look at. So how do you remember that past and not follow those mistakes that people had made before us? And learn from them. So fortunately in Charleston, in general, we've lost a statue of Calhoun, but in general, what we're doing is something a little different. Rather than tearing everything down, we're actually putting up new monuments to the people that have not been as well represented in the past. And so we're trying to spread our net a little wider and have monuments and signs and historical markers to a little bit broader cross section.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfectly legitimate and universally agreeable approach to this very sensitive topic.
Right.
But I agree with you. There should not be necessarily a glorification of these men, especially Calhoun, the
Sure.
intellectual force behind the secession and
Right.
its outcomes, but an education, right?
Right.
Perspective in their time and in their place. And it certainly helps as a tour guide, as someone describing this country.
And these men are, Calhoun's a complicated figure. I worked at the Andrew Jackson papers up in Knoxville, and Calhoun, of course, was his vice president. Every time I thought I started to understand Calhoun, he threw me for a loop. He's an important political thinker, though, and his disquisition on government, I think, is important reading, and it says a lot about the nature of federalism and control and governance.
Yeah, no, he wasn't a second tier thinker. He was
No.
he was quite an astute observer of things political, a philosopher in his own right. He may have come to conclusions with which we disagree or against which we recoil, but not lacking in intellectual power. That's for certain. So we're a little over time. I'll just ask you one final thing. Do you have any book recommendations that our audience can read? They can be sort of rudimentary that you might give to a first year freshman at the Citadel, or perhaps a little bit more advanced regarding the Civil War specifically, or maybe the antebellum time period.
Well, if you want to, South Carolina in general, there's a lot out there. I'd probably direct you towards my bibliography, of which it's about 25 pages. But I do think Charles Coffin, South Carolina Goes to War, is an outstanding book on South Carolina's Civil War history. There's a great book out there called Charleston, which is just a general history it's a history of a southern city, and that's very comprehensive in its nature. That would give you a good overview of all of Charleston's history, really from its founding up until the late 90s or so. There's a last name Rosen that writes a short history of Charleston, which might be more appealing for those that don't want a 300 or 400 page book on the city's history. And there's an interesting book on antebellum South Carolina is called Stephanie McCurry, Masters of Small Worlds. And that's actually, we kind of think of South Carolina as these huge wealthy plantation owners, rice barons, and that's true, but there were a lot of yeoman families, and she's written about yeoman farmers and their political culture and ideology, along with Lacey Ford's Origins of Southern Radicalism. So those are all good books. One of my favorite books on the Civil War in general is written by a professor emeritus now at University of Alabama, George Rabel, and his book, The Confederate Republic, A Revolution Against Politics, is probably the primary book that got me interested in this area of specialization.
Excellent. And I'll be sure to include links to all of these books below. I just finished one. If I can make one contribution to your excellent list and thorough list of books, I just read a work by Lord Charnwood, who was a British historian who lived, I think he was actually born the year that the Civil War died. I think he was born in 1865, and his work was extraordinary. So I'll include maybe a link to that as well. Yeah, I mention it only because it really was excellent. And I love the way in which he wrote his work. It was very, very enjoyable. So with that, Eric, Professor Lager, thank you so much for being so immensely generous with your time.
Oh,
I'll include a link to your business, to your tour,
in
the show notes below. Although it does sound like you're quite
it's picking up, but I offer a nice little walking tour. It's 2.5 hours, which is a half hour longer than most in town. And I'd say the nice thing that I do is 10 or less people. I don't take any more than 10, and the city allows up to 20, which is my opinion is too many for a walking tour. But it gives you we cover from the city's founding in 1670. I actually go back to the English Civil War and Charles I, who lost his head, all the way up to the city's the tours mostly colonial and antebellum and Civil War. But I get into some 20th century stuff as well. But yeah, I'd love for somebody to come join me on a walking tour, including yourself, Daniel.
Of course, I look forward to it. And as I said, my parents were absolutely enamored of it. It was their favorite part, I think, of South Carolina, of Charleston specifically. They absolutely were delighted by you and by the tour and by the city, of which you are so capable a representative. So is there any other platform on which people can reach you? Are you on Twitter or Instagram or
Oh, I'm on all
Facebook?
those things. Yeah, you can find me, Charleston History Walk. Just don't expect a lot of posts. I don't do a whole lot with that.
You might need a social media manager once
I
you're
might, I might, I
grow.
might, I might need to do a little bit more on that front. But I think that I'm getting the business I need from my reviews, and people are very generous to do that. So I'll suppose maybe I'll start doing a little bit more posting. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram as well as Facebook, Charleston History Walk.
Very good. So again, those are all platforms and sites to which I'll include links. And of course, you have my and my family's exuberant endorsement of, if you're in Charleston, especially as the weather gets a little bit nicer, we enter the springtime, please check out Professor Lager's his guided tour throughout Charleston. I think you'll have a great time. So with that, again, I extend to you my thanks, Professor Lager. You've been so generous with your time in delivering to us your wealth of information. I wish that we could talk much longer about this fascinating subject area.
Well,
But
it's my pleasure. I appreciate you having me on. This was very well done, and I wish you luck. You're doing a good thing.
thank you so very much. Well, with excellent guests like you, I think my role is quite small. I just need to listen and broadcast exactly what it is that you have to say. So with that, I wish everyone farewell and good night from Finneran's Wake.